So thank you very much for coming back for our afternoon session, which will be our last session for the conference. And this last session is being chaired by Professor Saundry. I will thank you very much for coming to chair the session. All right, so I'll leave the floor to Professor.
Hi, everybody. I'm not going to say very much. This is Richard, and he's going to talk about public engagement and networking. So we've got 5 minutes, maybe if you do 40 minutes, 10 minutes questions.
Yeah, if you get that far, yeah, that's fine. Yeah, you have to make it stretch that far. Thanks, Salima. Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Pleasure to be here. My name, for those who don't know me, I'm Richard Saundry. I'm a professor in the business school, and I work in the HR and leadership group, and I coordinate one of the theme research groups which looks at people, organisations and work. So most of my research is around sort of HR, work and employment. So I'm not going to talk about that at all today, although I've given you sort of a bit of an example for those of you who've got a handout, and I'll come to that a little bit later. But I was given this title of Public Engagement and Networking, and I have to say, when I first saw it, I first saw the word networking, I sort of was rather worried about that. So I think I'm probably the world's worst networker in terms of standing in a conference, sort of, meeting and greeting and having a glass of wine and sidling up to sort of powerful journal editors. I'm hopeless. So if anyone's got any tips on that type of networking, then I'd gratefully receive it. It's certainly sort of probably negatively impacted on my career at certain times. However, the more I thought about it, and really it's only sort of yesterday it sort of clicked, is that I shouldn't really be worried about talking about networking, because my PhD was based on looking at how freelance workers in the TV and broadcasting industries network and use networks in order to represent their interests and develop their careers and get higher levels of pay and get better deals from their employers. So it started me thinking about this, and actually what I'm going to talk about today, which I think is much more important, is not whether you can make small talk at a drinks reception in a conference, but it's about how you can build networks. Networking is a tool, and it's a tool which is changing quite significantly, and really a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today in sort of academic terms is networking, but it's networks and social capital. So it's building up stocks of social capital which you can use to get the sorts of outcomes you want from your research, whether that's in terms of career or impact or influence. And I think there are some very, I think quite basic things and considerations which we all can think about, but which as PhD students and those members of staff here, and particularly those in the early parts of our academic careers, very easily sort of go by the wayside. We very easily sort of omit to really think about them. So I think for those of you starting off on an academic career, hopefully what I've got to say will just sort of plant a few little seeds. So it's very practical what I'm going to be talking about. It's based completely on my own experience. This isn't based on any great sort of meta-analysis of what's out there in terms of research evidence. It's simply what I have found useful and the lessons I've learned in hopefully developing a body of research which has had some quite significant impacts in their own fields. Okay, I'm not going to say that I've had massive effects on the world and on society, which many people here would recognise, but in my world, I think some of the research that I've done has had an impact. And I'm going to talk about how and why. I'm more than happy if people want to get involved in the discussion as we go along. That's fine. I'd like to keep this as relatively informal because that's really what the topic is. So I think the first point I want to make is that the networks are more important than networking. I know lots of people who are great at the meet and greets at the conferences. And sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. But if that's all you've got, then that's a problem. I think that we all need to try to do in our own ways and which suit our own personalities, characters, etc., is developing ties and relationships. And that's where the social capital comes in. It's developing ties and contacts with people who are going to help our research in the future and whom we can help. And there's an important element in that social capital, for those that you know, key element of social capital is mutuality and reciprocity. And that the reciprocal nature of research and its impact is really, really important in this. So whenever you're doing your research, I think one thing to bear in mind is, what can my research do for a research user? Whether that's an individual member of the public, an organisation, an NGO, a government. What can it do for them? But also, what can I get back in return for that, and vice versa? Whether can we develop sort of reciprocal relationships which are mutually beneficial? And that's really important to bear in mind. If it becomes one way, either you just pour your research into an organisation and they use it for all it's worth. Similarly, if you just use an organisation to go and do your research and they never see you again, they're not going to ask you back. You know, they're not going to actually give you a great deal. So one of the key things when you're developing your PhD research, if you're engaging with organisations, think about what you're offering them. Don't just go in, do your research and disappear, because that's the perspective that lots of organisations have of academic researchers. They're not interested in the organisation. All they're interested in is their papers or their PhD. So developing those reciprocal relationships is really important. The next point is my sort of get out of the fact that I'm hopeless at small talk in conferences. And I think the way that we network is changing. So for me, that's a benefit. So I don't necessarily need to schmooze along with sort of like the great and the good necessarily, because increasingly the way you build up academic networks, it's a little bit of that, but it's much more through participation. It's much more through getting your work out into the public domain. It's much more through being able to use social media, for example, use technology quite effectively. So that opens up opportunities, and it also opens up access, I think, for people who perhaps, you know, do find that sort of traditional way of networking quite problematic and difficult. So we've talked about that, about mutuality and reciprocity. The last point is that content is absolutely key here, and that it doesn't matter how savvy a networker you are, and I've met quite a lot of people who are very good at this, but unless you have got research which tells a story, which does something for that, potentially provides something for those users that is good enough that it's going to get published in some of the better journals, all the networking is not going to make up for that. So the content, the research you are doing now is the most important thing. You have to have the raw materials in order to get that engagement further on. And I'll come back to it in a second, but I was talking outside just before this, and I think that one of the key things to bear in mind when you're doing your research as well, in order so that it actually has some resonance, is think about what story you're telling. When I first did when I started my PhD, I was employed as a researcher on a funded project. This was at the University of Leeds, and I'd come straight out of industry. I knew nothing about academia. I'd done a master's a few years before, and I gave my first sort of presentation of the work I'd done so far to 2 or 3 professors who were on the team, who were the PIs on the team, so the leaders of that research project, and they were sort of leaders in their field. And I sweated sort of blood and tears to sort of make this presentation. I talked 3/4 of an hour, and at the end of it, one of these professors just sat back in his chair, opened his eyes because they'd been closed, and said, "Just tell me what the story is." And I was devastated. I thought it was rude and the rest of it, but actually, and it was fairly rude, but it was a really salutary lesson for me, because whether you're trying to get a paper past the desk of an editor, or whether you're trying to get an organisation interested in the findings of your research, or trying to get a government select committee interested in your research, they are interested in the story. There needs to be a big story. So don't lose sight of that. Don't lose sight of what your research is about. Okay. I think we forget sometimes that as academics, we're also writers. There's also creativity to that process. And we are storytellers as well as being sort of people who analyse data. And I think that's important to bear in mind. Okay. So why do we do it? So what's the point of engagement? Well, personally, I think it's quite good fun because for a whole range of reasons. It changes the scene, it gets you out of the university, you go to interesting places, you meet different people. If you're teaching, I think it's really important because it keeps you grounded with what's actually going on in workplaces. So it's very easy for us when we're sort of writing our own research and we're in our own little bubble to a certain extent. Actually testing that out in the real world with people who potentially use these findings, use our research, is really important. Is really important. So I think it's something that's useful in itself. I think, and that sounds terribly grand, but personally, I think that's part of why a lot of us do the job that we do. And when I say changing the world, I don't necessarily mean creating, cures for incurable diseases. And some of our colleagues do that sort of fantastic work. And it's quite tempting to sort of pick up the Plymouth staff bulletin and look at some of the things that people do, and you think, oh, all I'm doing is changing a little bit of guidance on some government guidance that 50 people might read. But it's important that we think that we can still change our world in small ways, because for one person that's going to be significant. And I'll come on to why it's significant for you on an individual basis in a second. I think if our academic careers are simply about getting 3- and 4-star publications and the rest and all these things, which will be, as you develop your academic careers, those are things which will be thrown at you. If we lose sight of that, what our research should potentially does more widely, I think that's a shame. Very important is that it creates further opportunities for research. So many of you will be doing your PhDs at the moment at different stages, and you will have negotiated some access, or you'll be creating your samples to gather data, etc. Engagement with potential research users, whether it's businesses, whether it's voluntary sector organisations, whoever it might be, there's two things. Firstly, it prompts you to think about new things. It prompts you to think about the next project. And I know that most of you, the last thing you want to do at the moment is think about another project. You're thinking about your PhD at the moment. But as soon as you've done your PhD, you need to be starting about how you then develop it. What's the next thing? What's the new question that you're going to ask? There are a lot of people with PhDs out there who do their PhD, publish a couple of papers, and then there's a huge, great big gap in their CV because they've not thought about the next piece of work. So engaging with users, and this is why I'd urge you with the people, the organisations perhaps you're working with at the moment, maintain those contacts, because not only will they potentially prompt some new and interesting areas for research, but they'll provide some access to data. So nearly all the research projects that I've been involved with, I think probably all, actually, over the last 7 or 8 years, access to organisations has come from my existing networks. It hasn't come from putting out an appeal on social media or putting something on LinkedIn, however useful that might be, or just pumping out a survey. It's based on the people that I know who are happy to have me in their organisation because they know they're going to get something for that. It's going to be beneficial to them. We're going to find some interesting things that are going to help them. So, extremely important. Hire, I think, mentioned this yesterday. For grant applications, so again, many of you post-PhD, some colleagues here, staff members here, we think about this in terms of, putting together grant applications at the moment. In the coming years, you will not get be successful in grant applications in most instances these days unless you can demonstrate that you have engagement from the users of that research. And quite often you're going to be asked to provide a letter of support from an organisation to say, yeah, we love this research, we really want you to fund it, it's really vital to our core mission and goals, etc. And you don't get those sorts of letters if you just send somebody an email out of the blue. You get those sorts of letters from people who you've developed relationships with. And so there are certain people who I know I can go to tomorrow, and in 2 days they will give me a 2-page letter of support for a grant. Not that many, but there are some, and it's important that that we bear that in mind. I'll come back onto some of the issues around that in a second. And from perhaps a more what's the word? A more utilitarian perspective is that increasingly the impact agenda is one that universities are taking very, very seriously. And I think that if you can demonstrate that A, you're aware of that agenda, and B, that your research engages with the impact agenda, I'm going to talk about that in a second in a bit more detail, then that is fast becoming a requirement for new early career academic staff. And some of you were already looking at sort of potentially applying for posts and thinking about what you're going to do when you finish your PhD, or as you get towards the end of your PhD. One of the main questions that I certainly ask any sort of new aspiring academics who are applying for a job is, what's the potential impact of your research? Where does that go? I'm interested in whether they're going to publish from it. I'm interested in whether they have published from it. But I'm really interested in the impact as well. And having something to say about that is really, really important. So taking time to understand what the impact agenda is really important for a career at the moment in UK universities. And there's a reason why it's really important, which I'm going to get to.
Is there any difference between impact and implication?
When I use the word impact, I've got a very specific meaning, which I'm going to get onto. And it's, yeah, I'll come on to that, if that's okay. And if I don't answer it, come back and let me know. So this is where I'm going to get a little bit technical, but I think it's important. I sometimes think that as more experienced researchers, we quite often talk to audiences of people starting their careers, and we throw around terms like ref and impact and all these things, and people are going and nodding along, and we never actually explain it to anybody what this stuff really is. Certainly a lot of my colleagues, you know, who've been in academia for a while, if I talk about impact case studies, would say, you know, well, you know, what do they mean? What are they? And this is where I'm going to sort of talk about what impact is in my terms. So I'm talking about it in a fairly technical sense. I'm going to make a distinction here between what I call ref impact, which I'm going to talk about in a lot of detail, and I've termed it pathways to impact. And does anybody know where that phrase comes from? It's a very specific phrase in terms of funding. A particular funding body. So the Economic and Social Research Council, if you make a bid to the SRC, one of the documents that you have to provide, in addition to your bid saying what you're going to do and how much money you want, is a detailed plan of your pathways to impact. So when you are making a bid, you are not just asked about how many interviews you're going to do and what your research questions are and whether you've got user buy-in. You've got to produce a very clear plan which shows how you're going to take that research, take the outcomes of that research and convert that into a real world impact for user organisations or for the public or for society as a whole. The latter is much broader. So the latter includes the concrete impacts that you might have on an organisation, but it also includes plans over things like dissemination, public engagement in terms of organising seminars and workshops to publicise your research, etc. So pathways to impact is a broad concept. Ref impact is much narrower, and it is by no means the be-all and end-all. And as I said before, I think we do work because we want to change the world. But in every university in the UK at the moment, all they are particularly bothered about is the first one, is ref impact. So I'm going to talk a bit about that, and just give you a little bit of background in relation to what that means. So as part of the REF, which is the Research Excellence Framework, so you may know or may not know that every sort of 5, 6, 7 years we have this big exercise where the university has to submit the publications that its staff have worked on over the previous 5 or 6 years or have published, and they are assessed. They have to submit a document which outlines the environment for research, which would include things like this, what we do for PhDs and the sort of structures that we use to support PhDs. And those two elements are assessed, and we get a grade for that. And dependent on our grade, we get a certain amount of funding from central government. Or probably my colleagues would say we don't get very much funding from central government, but we get a sum. And it feeds through into things like league tables as well, which is why it's really, really important. And most of us are currently under a huge amount of pressure. So when I say us, I mean sort of established academic staff, huge amounts of pressure to publish in peer-reviewed journals. And probably your supervisors and in discussion, people have heard 2-star, 3-star, 4-star, whatever that means. But 3-star and 4-star are what we're all aiming for, sort of top-rated publications. And that's true because publications make up 60% of the score that the institution gets in REF. But one of the other elements that we have to submit are impact case studies. And those are essentially documents which set out the impact of a specific piece of research or body of research. And I imagine probably in the next REF, which is in 2021, Plymouth will probably have to submit 3 of these, probably maybe 4, depending on how many people are submitted into the REF, how many people have published sufficient numbers of publications. But impact case studies make up 25% of the REF score, a quarter of the score that you get. So our 3 case studies that we're going to submit at Plymouth, let's say, make up 25% of the overall REF score. Now, that means that a 4-star impact case, which is the best impact case you can get, it's the highest mark you can get for an impact case, is worth between 10 and 15 4-star journal publications. That's the value. So there's many of us around here. So if we get a 4-star publication, we're sort of, running around the Roland Levinsky celebrating. A 4-star impact case is equivalent to 10 or 15 of those. That's why it's important, and that's why every university in the UK, including this one, are investing a lot of money and time in impact. And it's why, as aspiring academics and existing academics, that's why we need to know about this agenda. So that's why I'm being a little bit, I'm stressing this. The handout which some of you have got, I'm sorry I didn't have enough to go around, so I didn't have quite as many people as here today, is an example of an impact case. So that's just to take with you. And that's an impact case that I wrote in 2008 based on my previous institution. And that was rated 4-star at the time. So that just gives you an example of the sort of thing that is being looked for in an impact case. Okay, I'm not going to go through it in massive detail, but I'm going to highlight just 2 or 3 aspects in relation to this. Oh, sorry, I've not got there quite yet. Just before I do that, just one thing, could you click on that link? Is that okay? One thing that I would recommend all of you do, whatever stage you're at in your career, and some staff will have already done this, is you start to log the impact of your research. And at Plymouth, they insist that people use this thing called the VV Impact Tracker. It's a bit clunky to get your head around, but it's something that's worth knowing about. Again, if you go to a job interview, go to an interview here, and you say, oh yeah, I've got my all my impact logged on my impact tracker, although there may not be very much there currently. This is one of the tools that people are using. If you write to research@plymouth.ac.uk, they will set you up with an account, and it's an online tool which allows you to link your research outputs with seminar presentations, with presentations that you might give at a conference, with meetings that you might have with research users, and to keep a very clear log of your impact over time. So I'm not going to talk a huge length about that, but it's something, have a look at that at some point, because it's something we've all had to catch up with over the last couple of years. So if, again, at the early stage of your career, it's a good idea to sort of start to use some of these things. Brilliant. Okay, but what ref impact cases are sort of about is that what we have to do, and what you need to think about when you're doing your research is finding demonstrable evidence of impact. So what we're encouraged to do, and what I would encourage all of you to do, is to think about how are you going to gather data, not just about your research, but about the impact that it has. So, for example, if you present your research to an audience, how are you going to gather the impact that potentially has on them? So simple things like evaluation questionnaires work. So that now any workshop that I would do, any engagement event, we have quite detailed evaluation questionnaires, because potentially that's some data of a little bit of impact that we've done. If you're working with a company, so your PhD research might be very specific about a particular process or a change in the way an organisation adopts different accounting procedures, or I don't know, you can fill in the gaps there. You need to try to, at the same time as gathering your data from that organisation, you need to try to keep contact with that organisation to see and be able to gather evidence as to whether your research has had any impact. So, for example, when you do your PhD research about we were talking about so interestingly yesterday about governance in the charity sector, that is a classic situation which potentially has a massive impact. So your PhD research may well come out with a series of recommendations of how charitable organisations can improve transparency. And that will hopefully get you a fantastic PhD. You'll go out of the Viva, singing and dancing. It will be a real shame if you don't then, before you, if you like, exit those organisations, don't set in place networks to see how they're going to potentially use the findings that you come up with. So that means going back to the organisation with your research, saying these are the findings, keeping in contact with them, and trying to log what that impact of that research is. Very too often, the easy thing to do is go into an organisation, we do our research, we get out there, we think, oh, God for that. We can then, go away and write our journal publication, and the organisation never sees us again. That's easy, but you're not going to be able to generate any impact through that. So,
I don't know if you or not. That sort of evidence, in terms of qualitative, that's good, save the users, or the impact, I've measured it because profit increased 10%. I mean, is there any...
Well, I think so one of the things the next point I was going to make is one way, particularly in business research, that you demonstrate impact is you get user testimonies. So for that case study that I've handed out today, I contacted the head of strategy of that organisation and said, could you write me a letter? And they wrote me a 2-page letter saying that my research had shaped their strategy and government policy. So that's great, I'm thankful. How was I able to get that letter? Because I had bent over backwards to help them for the previous 3 years. That's where reciprocity comes in. I'd done work for them, I'd done presentation after presentation after presentation. I hadn't claimed expenses on most of those, I'd funded that myself. I said yes to everything. I was able to get that sort of letter. So that's one way. The point that you make is a really good one, however. If you can demonstrate a causal link between the work that you've done and a quantitative organisational impact, then that is the absolute gold standard in impact case studies. Hard to do, but if you can demonstrate that, then that's quite important. But I think it's one thing that we need to do is when we're setting up our research is actually start to think about the impact and measuring it as part of the research design. Possibly too late for your PhD researchers, those of you who are PhD researchers, but think about that for the future possibly. Impact in terms of these ref impact cases is determined in terms of reach and significance. Just to explain those terms, reach is how many people you hit, okay, or the sort of the number of organisations you hit. Is it national? Is it international? Somebody was asking me yesterday about, is international impact, is that okay for impact cases for UK universities? Absolutely, it's fantastic because the reach is so much greater. You've got research of international significance, then that's a lot more valuable than research that just impacts on Plymouth. That's for sure. But the other thing is the significance of that research. So it's almost like the depth of the impact. So even if you're working with quite a small organisation or a small set of organisations, if you can show that the impact of your research has had a really profound impact on the way they do things, a really profound impact on the way they operate, then that will make up for that lack of breadth. Those two things alone, on their own, are not necessarily enough. You have to have a bit of both. It's not enough. It's not enough just to sort of, impact upon a lot of people. Okay. And the last point, and this is a really important issue, is you'll notice on the thing I handed out, is that we not only have to tell a little bit of a story about the impact of the research, but we have to demonstrate and show what was the underpinning research. And you'll have heard a lot about publications having to be 3-star and 4-star. The key thing about impact is that research doesn't have to be 3-star or 4-star. As long as it's of 2-star equivalence, that's enough for an impact case study. So if somebody tells you, and you'll hear this in this university and other universities, if somebody tells you, when you say, I've just got something published in a 2-star ranked journal in ABS, and they say, that's no good, it has to be 3 or 4-star, then tell them about the impact case, the relevance to impact cases. And quite often, lower ranked journals in relation to impact case studies can have greater impact than some of those higher ranked journals. Don't get this confused with journal impact factors. Journal impact factors are nothing to do with this. Okay, nothing whatsoever. So don't get that confused, but it demonstrates that a wider range of research is quite important. Okay, so I'm just going to race through this a little bit. So how do we engage? What are some of the ways in which I've done this? What are some tips? Do good and interesting research. That sounds really obvious, but the stuff you do needs to interest somebody out there. Think about the story you're telling and also think about the audience. Okay. The audience for a presentation at an academic conference is very different to the audience of research users quite often, and you need to be able to tailor your message in the right way. You need to be able to present it in an engaging way. A lot of research users will tell me that they work with some incredibly highly, high-ranking academics who are, superstars, but they cannot write in a way which engages with users. They can write 4-star journals, but they can't write a blog which people are actually going to read. And there is a real skill in trying to develop both those sides of your writing. Generally, and I say generally, it's not always the case, but generally most users, theory, criticality, that is a secondary thing. They're interested in what is the implications of your research for them. I recently did a report for one organisation, and I thought it was an absolutely fantastic literature review. Absolutely brilliant. And it would have been great in a journal. And they sent it back and said, look, just strip all that out. We're just not interested. We want a page. That's it. And that sort of dented my sort of academic pride a bit, but that's the name of the game. They are not particularly interested in academic discourses, in academic arguments, in academic debates, in what's important for us in 3- or 4-star journals. They don't understand any of that. What they want is the research presented in a way which is accessible to them and the people in their organisations or their constituencies. You'll get quite a lot of pressure as you go through your career to apply for sort of big grants from high-profile research councils. Some of the best opportunities for high-impact research is getting 5 grand here or 10 grand here from a government body or a professional association. And sometimes those small bits of funding will have much greater impact than £500,000 from the ESRC, for example. I'm not saying we don't want £500,000 from the ESRC, of course we do, but don't necessarily just pass by some of those other opportunities. One of my colleagues recently, Donna Ladkin, who's a professor in leadership here, did some research for the Inspectorate of Constabulary. I think £50,000, huge amount of work, but her conclusions for that research have gone straight into their policy making process, and she can demonstrate she's done some research and she has changed government policy at a national level. Absolutely fantastic bit of impact. The university didn't make much money out of the funding, but they potentially might make some money and might benefit from a very strong impact case study. I think journal articles, generally speaking, tend to have less impact. Haya mentioned this yesterday as well. You know, you submit something to a journal, it's going to get out perhaps, if best case scenario, 18 months, 2 years. By that time, the organisation doesn't want to know anymore. It's gone in many cases. Instead, what you need to try to find ways of getting your research out there quickly. Yeah, you're going to publish it in a high-ranking journal as well, but blog about it, perhaps put together working or research papers or policy papers for an organisation. Could you just click on that link? Is that possible? Yeah. Okay, so it's a 6-page discussion paper that came out of a seminar series that I ran with some other colleagues. That has had more impact than all the journal articles that I've ever published. It's a 6-page policy report. And that was published within 2 weeks of finishing the seminar series, not 2 years. So again, time is tight when you're early in an academic career. But some of these outputs, which don't sort of aren't very valuable for the ref in terms of publications, are very valuable in terms of impact. So bear that in mind. Thanks very much, Tuesday. Could you click on the next link as well? There's other things like blogs. So there's blogging sites like Medium, which you can just where you can write your blogs and post them up. You don't need to. I think it's free. This is a website called The Conversation, and this is a piece that a colleague of ours, Margaret Pryor in the business school, wrote about her research she's been doing about academics who are autistic and the implications for the workplace. That article, I can't remember the total number, but that had hits in the thousands. Your average journal article, even a great journal article, if you get hundreds, you're doing pretty well. That hits in the thousands. So she's currently trying to turn this work into 3- and 4-star journal articles. But immediately she got a big hit, short piece, and The Conversation, you can register on The Conversation, and if you've got a good story in your research, you can get your work out there very, very quickly to a very, very wide audience. So that's one I would recommend that you have a look at. Thanks a lot. Cheers. Thank you very much. Social media is really important. Increasingly, young academic researchers have Twitter profiles which they use professionally in a very active way. I'm not going to spend too much time thinking about that. If people are interested in that, I'll come back on that later. LinkedIn is very important, not just for sort of making contact, but posting work. I posted a couple of papers that we did recently on LinkedIn, and I think I got something like 5,000 views on that. Again, much more than I would ever get through using sort of traditional academic channels. Finally, my tip is, if somebody asks you to do something, if you can do it, say yes. Even if it doesn't go anywhere, it's probably worth it. I'll just run through these quickly again. There are some problems with this. One, I think, is that there's this difficult balancing act sometimes between our academic independence and working very closely with research users who want a certain outcome. They want the research in a certain form, and sometimes we have to negotiate that. I think that can be very tricky in certain cases. It's always important to remember as well that research is a political process. So you might have some really strong and very distinctive arguments, but that sometimes can impact your reach or your influence in other quarters. So sometimes there's arguments I really want to make, quite political arguments about working employment. And I hold back a bit because I know that the government aren't going to take me seriously if they think I'm coming from a certain specific political position. And that's just the real politic of getting involved in these things. It's difficult to turn what are quite our complex, really detailed academic research into a page or into 3 paragraphs. And I think sometimes as academics we get really frustrated about that. And I think we have to sort of loosen up a little bit about it. But it's not straightforward. It can be really difficult to get those key messages across. And it's something that you learn. It's not something that, that is just there easily. And finally, it is time consuming and it's quite costly. And sometimes it goes unrecognized by the institution. So you need to make it pay. I think it's worthwhile doing for all the reasons we've talked about, but you need to make sure that your institution, your line managers, your supervisors know what you're doing and know how important it is. Because it can be a little bit invisible. Okay, that's me. Thank you. Sorry for going on a bit.
Can I just add something?
Yeah, of course.
Probably my career wouldn't have been where I am if I didn't did any networking and external engagement and knowledge exchange, you name it, and I have done it. And it really comes from the fact that very often when you're writing a paper, you publish it. What I usually do is I've got links. I'm actually a professor of the Institute of Credit Management. And I've got a magazine, and that's how I started doing it, saying, look, I wrote this article. Can I do just a page and a half? And it's not easy at all. And I found this page and a half, which goes to a magazine, was read much, much, much more than my 3-4 star papers. And because they have got international audience as well, it has been read by people all over the world. I went to Nigeria, Ghana, South Africa, Europe, as a result, not of my academic papers, but as a result of those small articles, which I actually shape into something which professionals benefit from.
Yeah.
And that is, of course, you do it once and twice and 3 times and you get better at it. To start with, it's almost impossible. How can I turn this academic paper into 4 pages or 2 pages? But gradually, you know what the audience wants. You actually know what they want and you do it. And they absolutely love it.
Yeah.
And as a result, you get people contacting you, and I say to them, I always call it knowledge exchange. I give you the results of my research if you help me. Most of my research is based on this community, the credit community, where I do presentations to them every year on my latest research. And I'm more than happy to be interviewed, to do questionnaires, and it's a win-win situation. You have to show there is something for them in it. Otherwise, what's the point? And as Richard said, it's not you do it once and you stop. You keep going back. And then everybody knows you. And then, from there, I went into sort of, the government introduced the legislation, which was very costly. I was asked to look at it. And they changed the whole legislation as a result of that impact.
Yeah.
So it's hard work and you do it constantly, but it really does pay. And you get lots of satisfaction out of it. So just what I'm here to do.
I think if you think about when you send up a paper to a journal, you get that acceptance, and that's absolutely fantastic. But certainly, in my experience, that's the last I might get this one person on ResearchGate or somebody saying, can I have a copy of that? Or somebody 3 years down the line, go, oh, I quite like that paper that you wrote. But the stuff that Salim was talking about, you get some real feedback quickly about, that research really helped and that really had an impact. And so I think it's really, really important. And it's going to get more and more important. So, as you develop your academic careers, then certainly in the UK, in the next 5, 10, 15 years, impact is only going to get more important. It's going to be more, compared to journal publications, the traditional journal publication we have now, impact is going to become relatively more important over time. And I don't think that's going to stop, because institutions like this are under pressure to demonstrate how they contribute to society. And that agenda isn't going away.
Any questions? Yeah.
I was just wondering, so how do you turn the academic article, or simplify the academic article, and as a junior trying to get into academia, do you start with those one-page articles or simple for practitioners, or you aim to publish first in those those star journals, and which would be more beneficial for you?
Well, I think sometimes it depends. But generally speaking, as I said, so if you go for a 4-star journal, if you submit a journal article today, if you get that published online, not print in print, in 18 months, that is rare. You would be doing fantastic work. In 2 years, that's okay. I've had papers which have taken 2.5, 3 years. So I've done the research in 2010. The paper's actually been published in print in 2014, by which time the people who commissioned that research on which it was based have moved on, they've forgotten all about it. So my advice would tend to be, as soon as you've done your research and you've got findings, you've got enough to write something, because you know what the implications of those are. They're not that short piece doesn't need to have conceptual frameworks, doesn't need to be underpinned by huge amounts of literature. They want to know, what have you found? And you can get that out there into the public domain, build a bit of buzz, and then actually, I think, strengthens your it strengthens journal submissions, because people start to hear about you. So I didn't get a chance to talk about Twitter. So one of the things that I would do if I was starting out now is, as soon as I've got my research, I think that's a really interesting bit of the story. People are going to be really interested in that. I would write something. I would go to the conversation, try and get a piece on there, or maybe write something for Medium and then tweet it out, and sort of, try to put it on LinkedIn, try to get people interested while I'm doing my academic research. As long as you're careful about, obviously, if you're just sort of then, you've got to be careful about self-plagiarism and things, but normally, if you're doing a 250 word, 500 word blog, it's going to look so different to your final academic paper. So I'll give you a good example. I'm doing something at the moment. We did a short 2-3 page report, which was just the findings. And I'm currently writing an article which has some really quite complex conceptual underpinnings, which hopefully I will get published in a few years' time, and hopefully a few people will read it. It might get cited a bit, but it will probably have no impact whatsoever on anybody in the real world. That is the reality of the game. Occasionally, you get something in a journal and it catches the sort of public attention and it has an impact then, but I think it tends to be the former. Yeah. If that makes any sense.
Conversely, I a couple of times did a consultancy report for the government, and then I turned that into a paper.
Yeah.
Because they gave me the funding, I did the research, I got the results, and I thought, I've got this, I need to underpin it with some theory and everything. And that was, you can do it the other way around. And I thought it was impossible to do that, because it was 30,000 words. And I managed to turn it into 6,000 paper. Because I had the data, you see it, you turn it into something completely different. like Richard said, you have to be careful about plagiarism. All I do, I take a paper, take my results and put them in a plain understanding. Somebody in a company will understand this. They don't want to know the theory. They don't need to know where my data came from. I just have these results and I put them in a language which they want to hear, which is useful to them. What am I going to do with this?
The other thing about getting funding from governments and government bodies is that because they've given you, say, not very much money, say £10,000 to do a bit of research, and then maybe publish a report, in most instances, they've invested £10,000 of their money in your report. So it's in their interest to promote it. It's in their interest to take it into account in terms of their policy making considerations. So you don't have to fight to get your work into the policy making sort of channels. It's already there. So that's why some of the sort of research that Salim was talking about for, it might be for a government body or a professional association, some of that funding, even if it's quite small, is incredibly powerful. And I think that's something always to keep an eye out for those sorts of opportunities.
But you have to go and find them.
Yeah.
They don't come to you. Yeah.
Thank you. What you say you have to go and find them is between networking and publicizing your work. I think,
yeah.
Which one draws more audience for you as networking? Networking, physical networking, meeting people in conferences.
I tend, not personally, unlike Richard, I'm one of those people who go to conferences and talk to everybody because I'm very sociable. And talk to everybody and introduce myself, and little me, sometimes they have never heard of Plymouth University or whatever, and you really have to take your business card and just say, what your research is about, whatever. But I think what I get mostly is actually when I do once a year a professional conference which attracts about 1,000 people. And this is where I get most of my networking from. Those are the people who always come back to me and say, we've got this, would you like to investigate it? In my previous universities, I managed to do sort of short courses for SMEs, for instance, and that attracted so much money to the university. I didn't get any of it myself, but it was as a result of somebody in the audience wanting to look at something which they had actually with legals, and they had some problem with cash flow. They wanted to train their staff into understanding what petty cash is about. And I went from there into doing a huge seminar for IBM. So that's how it works, really, but a huge audience came from actually professionals.
I think I just say they're different things. So your networking might do an academic conference is really valuable for certain things in terms of getting advice, getting into academic networks, potentially, meeting journal editors and things like this. And the sorts of things it seems they're talking about professional conference have another different outcome. I would say that I do think things like, so particularly for academic research in certain areas in business research, things like Twitter, whoever might be skeptical about it, young researchers are making quite big reputations by being very active on using social media and getting their work known way beyond what they've achieved in terms of academic publication through using those sorts of networks quite sort of carefully and judiciously. Okay. Red card.